Well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. I've been kind of watching the program evolve and develop, and I'm excited to kind of be here and hopefully share some things that are interesting and that are useful for you guys as you finish up and get out into the field. So I also wanted to mention, this is a relatively small group, and so as I sort of thought about what I wanted to talk about and what I thought would be useful, I thought I'd start just sort of reviewing what my background is, what my career is, so you guys can kind of see what my path has looked like. Second, kind of jump into specific recommendations or like things that I have found that work really well kind of during the interview process. And then lastly, have Q&A. But if there's any questions that come up, like definitely let's have a discussion. So feel free to raise your hand and we'll answer any questions you have. So any questions before I start? All right. So I guess to start, I am an Aggie, and so I like to go all the way back. I grew up in New York, but I came out to Utah State and spent some time here doing my undergrad. So did two different programs, dual majored in international studies and Spanish, and I was one of these people who, I started off as a fine arts major, and then I moved over to graphic design, and then I took a landscape architecture class, and like through that, I'm sure no one else has done that. You guys have all been dialed from day one. But for me, I moved around a little bit. And so when I graduated from Utah State, I got into retail banking and did that for just long enough that I knew that I didn't want to do that. And so decided to go back to school. And even at the time, I was passionate about the outdoors. I wanted to get into the outdoor industry. And there wasn't as clear of a path then as there is now for you guys. So knew I needed to get more business experience, and so went to Thunderbird and spent 2 years there getting an MBA. The last course that I took at Thunderbird was called Business Plan. And so Business Plan, just like it sounds, right? You go through the process of writing a full business plan kind of from scratch, right? Like you identified a need in the market, you created a product or a service, and then you did the whole sort of forecasting and financial models and did the whole thing. So what I found out later was this was the closest thing that I took during either of my college experiences in product management. It was like the closest to a product management course. And what I found was that I loved that class, that I was really passionate about that. And I remember sitting down with my professor and sort of asking him, he was this guy who had started all these companies, said, so what do you recommend? When I leave school, should I start a company or should I go and get a job? And he said, if you've got a really good idea, don't be afraid to start a company, but if you don't, he recommended sales and product management, right? So that's what I did. That's kind of where I started. And so a company that recruited a lot from this particular program was Hilti, which is a European power tool manufacturer. So I worked for those guys for a couple of years. I knew that if I went and worked for them that I could get an opportunity to try product management. So spent 2 years in sales, spent 2 years as a product manager, and then it was at that point when I started knocking on a lot of doors and talking to a lot of people and really achieved the goal that I'd had for a long time, which was really getting in the outdoor industry. So Thule at the time, and you guys are probably familiar with Thule from bike racks. At the time they were really getting into a lot of different categories. They actually run a lot of businesses, or they did run a lot of businesses that weren't really related to outdoor. So for example, they had a horse trailer business. They actually had a sub-brand that did like work kits for the back of pickup trucks. But they started working and kind of refining their brand, and they got rid of some of those businesses, and they started really focusing on being like a carry solutions brand. So I was hired on this team to work on electronic device cases, right? And now you've seen cell phone cases, tablet cases, laptop bags, like all those products. That's kind of what I was part of developing there. And so Thule was really interesting because at Thule you owned kind of the whole product process. So you really identified a problem, you created this whole line strategy and category launch strategy, and then you ran it all the way through end of life. So Thule was really a great experience and was really a good introduction to product management. So after Thule, I had the opportunity to go to REI. And REI is one of those brands where, you know, if you're in the outdoor industry and REI calls with an opportunity or you get an opportunity to work there, sort of felt like, you know, I needed to go and experience that. And so worked on the private brands team. And, you know, what I found out pretty quickly is that REI is a massive company, right? You don't sort of realize it. They seem relatively, I mean, compared to a lot of companies, they're relatively small. But I remember the first week I had an HR question. And so I kind of went around and asked and said, you know, who do I ask? Because at Thule, you just kind of walk down the street or walk down the hall and you talk to Noel, and that's who you talk to, right? And they said, well, you got to email hrhr@rei.com. And I was like, what do you mean? You know, you just email them? So it just went into a black hole. Had no idea who it went to, right? So just kind of like two total different extremes. But one of the great things about working at REI is having the opportunity to work on a lot of different product. So I redid their travel gear, worked on duffel bags and travel packs, and you know, a lot of the, if you see like the technical duffels, that's one of the products that I did. And then also redid their sock program, worked on socks and or hats and gloves, worked on a bunch of hard goods as far as camp gear and that type of product as well. So any questions while I'm kind of just cruising along? Or yeah.
What years were you at REI?
That's a good question, man. I'd have to pull out my resume. I'm thinking I was there between, let me think, I've been at Oboz for about 3 years. So I was there before that, I guess. So probably 2015 to 2017. Do you know someone that worked there, or?
I've just worked there for a while, so just trying to pinpoint the design.
Yeah, and if you've worked there, I don't know if you've seen those backpacking hammocks. Those were two of the products that I did as well that I'm kind of proud of. Those are kind of cool products. So, yeah. So again, after REI, again, I had kind of worked at this really massive company, this massive business, and really wanted an opportunity to work at a smaller company. And Oboz was a footwear brand that I heard a lot about internally because they were growing a lot. They were sort of this small upstart, but that was getting a lot of traction. And so was really looking to be part of like more of an entrepreneurial company and kind of more part of that founding. And so had the opportunity to go to Oboz, and I was their first product manager. So it was like the complete opposite of REI, where they already have everything sort of totally dialed and process and team and structure. And it was really like, you know, I remember starting and they didn't have a multi-year product plan. It was like you sort of just showed up and said, okay, what are we going to do for spring 19? And you kind of banter some ideas around. And so those were some of the things that I did in the first year at Oboz, was help them to set up kind of that initial structure that you need to kind of help product be less reactive and more strategic. So did that with those guys for a year, and then was promoted to the director of product. Kept doing sort of all of the product management things, but then I took on management of the development team, managed a quality team in Vietnam, and took on sustainability. And so sustainability was a major part of my job during that time. So, any other questions? Chase said you guys were really talkative, so I'm a little surprised there were no. Yeah, go ahead.
So, as a product manager,
Yep.
are you doing any of like it's obviously different for every company, but
Mhm.
for Oboz specifically, since you were the first one, what's kind of your scope of duties, I guess? Are you going to talk about that at all?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, it's a great point that product management is one of those things. You know, you look at product management, product line manager, category director. You know, in CPG they call it a brand manager. So all those things are kind of the same role to some degree. Like you said, every company has a little bit of a different like level of scope there. You know, if I go back to Hilti, as I mentioned, Hilti's this big company. It was like a Swiss-German company where their development process is super structured. And so there it was basically like, hey, we hand you the project, you do your little piece, and then you sort of pass it along. So mainly what I was doing there was it was required that at every phase of development you would get a sample, and you would have to get direct customer feedback on the sample. So like I was over North America, And so in that role, I would get a sample, I'd get a prototype of like a concrete drill, and I would set up focus groups throughout the country, and we'd do 3 or 4 different cities, and I'd work with, you know, a company who would recruit people to come out. We'd create a survey, we'd actually have them use the tool, and then I would take that information and basically go back to them and say, you know, there's something specific about the U.S. market that you're missing. You got to change this, or you're, you know, because the U.S. market was 20% of their business, and so that's really what I focused on. And then also sales execution, right? So going out and helping the sales force kind of launch products. That was a big part of what I did at Hilti. At Thule, because it's so much of a smaller, or I'm sorry, at Oboz, because it was so much of a smaller brand, I mean, you have a really wide breadth of work, right? But at the root of it, it's about understanding the customer and the market, right? And using different research methods to kind of understand the market and the customer. And then your main function is like funneling that together into a product brief, right? And so you're identifying, here's the key problems that we're trying to solve as a team, or here's the key market opportunity. And then from there, you are the voice of the customer throughout that process. So you're going back, and when you're working with the designer, you're saying, hey, listen, remember how the brief says this? I'm not seeing that in the product that you're, you know, in the designs you're showing me. So, you know, you're sort of always bringing the team back to the brief throughout that process, and you're the hub, right? So you bring in marketing, you bring in packaging, you bring in the sales team, and you're sort of that hub between all the different departments within the company, if that makes sense. And then the product team, I don't know how much you guys have talked specifically about the product team, but in most organizations, you kind of look at it as like a 3-legged stool between product design, product development, and product management, and you're kind of the core product team, and the exact duties sort of vary by organization, but that's sort of the core team that's working on the product. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. So that sort of takes me to what I'm doing now, and you know, spent 3 years at Oboz. Like I mentioned, I spent a bunch of time working on sustainability. So I had the opportunity to continue working for Oboz, but I've transitioned out of a consulting role. So launched my own consulting business, which is Betagraph Consulting. And so basically what I'm focusing on with Betagraph is what you see is that a lot of small brands, and Oboz is a good example of that, you know, they waited until they were a $30 million business before they hired a product manager. But there's a lot of companies that are smaller than that sort of need product management expertise, but can't afford to bring on someone full-time. So there's an opportunity to be sort of like, there's fractional CFOs in a lot of organizations, so sort of be a fractional product manager. So doing some of that, as well as helping people with their kind of overarching sustainability strategy, which is becoming, again, that's a bunch of what I did at Oboz, continue working with them on that, and something that, especially when you're in the product world, sustainability is something that more and more you guys are going to be dealing with. So it's something I'm passionate about, and it's been a lot of fun to kind of help people work through. So working on that, and then the other thing I've been working on is a project called Outdoor PM School, and what I'm doing there is basically, it's the program that I wish I would have had when I was trying to get into product management, and it's a course that I'm going to be teaching. So, questions, comments? No. Chase is quiet back there too, so no questions, Chase? All right. So I thought that I would start sort of the second part and talk about sort of some specific recommendations for when you guys go out and interview for jobs. And I thought I'd start by telling you a story about my experience. So I mentioned I did this MBA program. You know, a lot of people that I was going to school with were literally interviewing for like Goldman Sachs, right? And in that world, it is required that you wear a suit to an interview. Like, it's not even an option, it's not even a question, like, you're that guy that's wearing the suit, right? So I remember when I had the opportunity to work at, or to interview at Thule, I was like, man, I don't know what I should wear, but I'm pretty sure I got to wear a suit. So I totally wore a suit, right? So I roll up. I remember I walked into the lobby, and my hiring manager just sort of looked at me and smiled, and he's like, nice suit. And so luckily it didn't cost me the job, but my first recommendation is you don't want to be this guy, right? Don't show up in the suit. But what I would also say is you don't really want to be this guy either, right? Like there's a middle ground of what is the right thing to wear to an interview, and this is probably not what I would recommend. Although the guy's definitely, right, definitely stylish.
Dapper.
Yeah, definitely dapper. You know, I think I have the habit, and I think it's a good habit, that regardless of where you're interviewing, I would highly recommend just asking them what is appropriate for an interview. Most people are going to say business casual, but asking them specifically sort of what that means at their company is a question I think is worth asking, just to make sure you're kind of on par. The other thing that I would say is when you go out for an interview, like take that as an opportunity to figure out what, like the brands you're wearing, the products you're carrying with you, the shoes you're wearing, what those say about you as a designer, right? Like what are, you know, what is it that you have in common? Like if you're wearing an Arc'teryx jacket, like why are you wearing that jacket? What is it that you want to communicate to the person that's interviewing you about your design aesthetic or like your design philosophy, right? And use that as an opportunity to talk about brands that you want to talk about, and to talk about, you know, sustainability or whatever it is that you guys are passionate about. So the next thing that I would recommend is taking product. And this goes back to like what you wear to an interview, but also take things that, like if you're interviewing for a hiking boot brand, like take your favorite pair of hiking boots and have things that you talk about, like why do you love that design? What is it about that design that you're interested in? Because it shows a thought process, and it shows you know, like a level of interest in the product that I think is super telling, and it kind of shows people your passion. I think also just product that's interesting, like even if it's not your favorite product, but let's say there's a new product, a new shoe that is super sustainable, right? Like bringing that product and have something to talk about during the interview, I think is a really good thing to do as an interviewee. Good idea, bad idea? I got one thumbs up, thanks. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is networking. And you know, I don't know if that's something that you guys really discuss in class, but I personally think that LinkedIn is one of the most underutilized resources that you guys have. And you know, it's something that I wish people would have talked to me about like earlier in my career. You know, starting to build up that network from day one, I definitely would recommend starting, like if I get an invite from someone who's an alumni from Utah State or from Thunderbird, like I automatically accept them. And I think as a student, you're in a really unique position where people are interested in just sort of helping you out, right? The more people you connect with now, the more connections that you have and people that you can reach out to at different organizations once you're actually looking for a job. And so doing it while you're not looking for a job is definitely the best time to do it. So if you haven't started doing it, definitely recommend doing it now. On the other side, I am a super big believer in handwritten letters. And I think that this is also something that's super underutilized when people are networking. Once you start building up your LinkedIn connections, one of the things you want to do is reach out and say, hey, listen, I'm familiar with your brand. I like what you guys are doing. I'm a student. I'd love to get 30 minutes to just learn more about what you do, right? Not the expectation of getting a job, which would be a mistake, but just the expectation of just learning about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I would always follow up with a handwritten note. It's easy to get the address of the company, put their name on it, send it off, and it makes a huge impression on people. The other thing you can do that, again, I think is super underutilized is once you're actually looking for a job, let's say there's a brand you're really familiar with, you've noticed that they're all of a sudden going after a younger customer, right? Work on a couple designs, write a handwritten letter to the person who's the hiring manager, send a couple designs, and say, hey, I noticed you guys are starting to go after a younger customer. I worked on a couple designs that I thought are relevant to your brand and relevant to this new market segment. I'd love to chat. I'd love to talk through the designs and hear what you think. And writing in a handwritten note instead of an email really actually gets people's attention. And every time I've seen it tried, it works. So it's kind of like go the technology route and then like go the super analog route and take the time to write and send an actual note. The other thing, and so this goes back to kind of what I mentioned with with sort of what you wear and sort of taking something to an interview. Something that I think separates people who really excel during interviews are people who sort of have a story that they want to tell, right? Because you're going into an interview and that person, they have the 12 questions that they're going to ask you and they have the information that they want to get, but you should also have the 10 things or whatever those key things that you want to communicate to them and that you want to leave them with, and you should really like proactively know what those are, right? So that you can figure out how to work those into the discussion and work those into the interview. And I think if you go and just sort of take what they give you, then you're losing a huge opportunity to kind of tell your own story, right? And that can really separate you during an interview. The other thing that's super important is showing your passion. And when I think about this, and I think about people that I've interviewed or interviewed with that have done this really well, like you guys all know that the outdoor industry is all about passion, and you're there because you want to be involved in either an activity that you're interested in or you just love the industry. So you got to find a way to work in without sort of overdoing it and talking about your recent like LCAP summit or something. Like how do you work in to the discussion so they know you're passionate, right? Because that's sort of like an entry point to be in the industry. Work that into the conversation. It's definitely important. The second thing is making sure that you show passion and that they know that you're like super excited about product. Because you'd be amazed at how many people come in as designers or or developers, and you can tell they're just not super passionate about like building product. And so I think when we talk about what clothes you take, what product you bring in to talk about, and how you frame that discussion, like that shows that passion, right, for product and for product creation. And then the last one is showing passion for the brand and the category. And I know this will be news to all of you, but every brand that you interview for will not be like your number 3 top brand, right? Like you're going to interview with brands that you might have to dig a little deeper to find why you're passionate about them or what there is to be passionate about that brand, but it's super important that you do that. And because that really comes through. If you don't do that, like that comes through in an interview. So, and then the other part is just the category. And I remember when I was interviewing at Oboz, I was interviewing with the CEO, John Connolly, and I've worked for some pretty good brands in the outdoor industry, and I remember one of the last things he said to me was, listen, I know you've worked in these other brands, you've done these categories, but like, we're really footwear people. And like, are you going to be okay with, like, he was really concerned that I wasn't going to be passionate about footwear. So even among categories, whatever the category is, like, show the passion, find the passion for that category regardless of what it is. If it's socks and you're not super psyched about socks, like, what is it about socks that you can get excited about, right? And you got to be able to find that. Okay? The next is work samples, and I learned a little bit more today with Chase kind of walking around and learning what you guys are working on and how you kind of develop your portfolios and the different types of projects that you're working on. And so I think there's some really great things that you guys are working on and that it sounds like you're already kind of addressing, but still a couple things I wanted to mention. Obviously you're going to take a portfolio, you're going to take work, but there's a few things that I think are really important. You really want to show problem solving and process. And so I think I've seen a lot of designers come in and they sort of just show you like their perfect portfolio of like, here's my 10 amazing designs, where they're like totally, just really refined artwork. And those are interesting to see, and you might include those, but make sure that you include some work that shows the full process. Like, show the messy concepting at the beginning, show a finalized design, show the 3D that you did, and show the 3D part. And I didn't realize how much 3D you guys were working in, so that's great to see. But showing that full process and being able to talk about what you learned about the design at each phase is something that you'd be amazed how often is missing from designers that come in. And really helping people understand that you understand how to solve problems, because really design is all about solving problems, right? And that's a super important piece. Any questions or comments? Am I I don't know if that's controversial to say that or if that's on. Okay. Yeah.
So it's something that I always see when I'm looking at, job listings for different companies
Mhm.
that, we are passionate about. I feel like I get caught up with a lot of the requirements, like, X amount of years in the industry already.
Mhm.
It's like, how can we kind of like circumvent that just coming straight out of school?
I think what I mentioned with networking is the way that you do that. Because, it's not a great situation when you're applying like cold without any experience in the industry. And the first job is always going to be the hardest, right? I think you just sort of accept that and know that you're going to have to knock on more doors. Like it was a heck of a lot easier to get a job with Oboz than it was with Thule, right? And that's sort of, like, that's part of the process. But the power of having a LinkedIn network, and even if you don't know all those people, but the point is, when you're interested in a brand, once you really start building that network of people, then you've done phone interviews and you've reached out and had conversations with people. And so when a job comes up at a certain brand, you either know somebody at that company or you know someone who knows someone at that company, right? And that's a huge advantage. And also that proactive step of like reaching out with a handwritten letter is a huge differentiator. And you can't do that for every brand, but if there's like 3 brands that you're super passionate about and that you really want to get a job with, then I would connect with the people who have your job title that you want at that company, the hiring manager, like whoever the VP or director is above them, and the CEO, and someone in HR. Like if you can get that covered, then, because hopefully, again, you've done the work before so that when a job does come up, you can say, hey, remember 6 months ago I reached out and we kind of spent some time going through some designs I did? I saw this design posting came up. I'm still looking, I'm super interested in your brand. Can we talk? And I think that is the way to kind of break through the online application portal hell that, that you guys find yourselves, that everybody finds themselves in sometimes. So, and that, and I think to do that in an authentic way, you have to start earlier. And so if you start only when you're looking for a job, then people are like, oh, this guy's just looking for a job. He doesn't actually want to build a connection or, or offer any value, right? So start now, because people are way more willing to do that type of, like, take that type of time with students. But you guys definitely still have time. So great question, though. Yeah.
So you said handwritten letters are fantastic, but what if your handwriting looks like chicken scratches? Calligraphy classes on the side?
I would say whatever you can do to like put a personal touch on it. I don't know. I would say if you don't want to write it, like if it's that bad that you don't want to write it, I would say write it really slow if it's that bad.
Okay.
But if that doesn't work, then type it out. But fold it up, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and like send it, right? Because people get millions of emails, and even if you have their email, then it's like it's just another email, right? Like there's no buy-in. They get when you start working for these companies, like you get emails constantly from vendors, people who want jobs, from factories, from all types of people, and but when you get something that's handwritten, or I would say if you can't, like type it out and sign it, and then put it in an envelope and mail it, because then it's going to land on their desk and it's got a handwritten like address on it, and then they actually open it. And if you're showing them a design, like print up the design and put it in the envelope, and put a link to your portfolio. It does make a huge difference. And you can't do that with everyone, but use it for the people that you're the most psyched about and where you like really want to make an impression. All right. Next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, there was this designer at Thule that I worked with who was a super smart guy, and he had this t-shirt that says, with great artwork comes great responsibility. And what he meant by that is a lot of times you get designers that come in, and you see this especially with people who kind of come through the Nike route, because they just sort of draw something and then they throw it over the fence and it gets made by a totally different team. And that's just not the way that it works in 90% of the, at least in the outdoor industry. And so being able to, like if you have a design concept and somebody in an interview points to something and says, so what material were you thinking for this particular like overlay, right? And like if you can't answer that, then that's a problem. And I've run into that with designers that we had contracted with. Like, what is this material? And they have no idea. Or this looks like a really like challenging construction here. Like, how are you thinking that would? And not that you have to have all the answers, you know. But I think showing that you thought through it is really important and can really set you apart. And also, I would say once you're in the industry, really leveraging like those relationships with developers if you are a designer, and with factories to really like take interest in that, because not all designers do. And I think that sets you apart, you know, being a much better designer than, you know, sort of sets you apart from the pack, for sure. If you can, the more you can learn, right? The more you can, the closer that product is to being like a design-ready design. So, and then the last thing I wanted to bring up before we kind of go to Q&A is practicing. And so, you know, I think there's a huge difference, and you can usually tell when people, especially when you're first starting out interviewing, like if you haven't practiced, it's pretty clear that you haven't practiced. And a couple things that I would recommend, and I'd recommend doing them like starting right now. Create a list of interview questions that people commonly ask designers. And you can do that by going on Glassdoor. I don't know if you guys go on there very often, but you can go on Glassdoor. They have actual interview questions that people have posted who have gone for a specific role. So start there, right? You can Google, you know, design or industrial design interview questions. Start with a dozen, right? And then take the time to sit down and write out your responses. You know, you do that over a period of time, and all of a sudden you have a list of 50 questions where you've sort of thought through what your response would be, and that's a really, really good start, right? And then once you've actually kind of formulated those questions, I know this is not going to be popular. Like, I hated doing it when I was in school, but sit down and practice with someone, and it makes such a big difference. I think you guys have a huge advantage because you feel stupid while you're doing it. But pick someone else in the program, so they're going to feel stupid, and then you're going to feel stupid, and so you can just deal with it together. But it's worth it. Like, have them ask you the question and give you a response, right? And you've already worked it out because it's pretty much, you've already sort of thought through it because you've written up these questions, right? So that's really important. And then the next two things, now that you've got this list and you've probably got your like top 12 questions, you can go, and a week before the interview, you can spend some time reading through those questions. The day before the interview, I'm going to read through the top 10. It's all sort of fresh in my mind, and I'm ready to go, right? I think that also has a lot to do with what I was talking about being proactive, about like telling your story. Once you sort of have those core, like, this is the project I want to focus on, and this is how I want to talk about it to people, and this is what I'm trying to get across by telling that story, you can use that story for 5 different questions, right? And you should really think of yourself like a politician. Like, you know, politicians get ask a question, they don't answer the question, and they just sort of answer the question that they wanted you to ask, right? You can do the same thing, right, to some degree. Like, you want to answer the question, but you can also take the opportunity to sort of make sure you're getting across what you want to get across to the interviewers. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was that when you're going through your list, the foundation of that, and the first one, like, if you don't do anything else, go home, write down, question number 1 is walk me through your resume, right? And then, because that question is so, like, number 1, you know that question is coming. It's always the first question that you're going to get asked. It's also your opportunity to answer it exactly the way you want to answer it, right? And the way you should think about that question is, what are all the experiences that I've had that lead me to be the perfect candidate to get this job, right? Like what has led me here to be in this interview to get this job? And, you know, you can get a lot of the points that you want to get across in that initial question if you take the time to think through it in advance. And there's always going to be some version of that question during interviews. So that's it. I think we're at Q&A. Chase, question number 1.
Oh, this is their time. I talked to you earlier.
Yeah,
So
go
can
ahead.
you tell us a little bit about that outdoor PM school you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, what I've found is that, I mentioned that I didn't have, like, there was never a product management course, right? And so what I found was that you have to learn on the job. And I think what I've been observing is that, like, in the technology space, there's a lot of these online certificates, right? And I have people reach out and they say, hey, would it help to take one of these courses? And I'm like, well, no, it wouldn't, because technology is so different from like physical products that it's really not that relevant. Like, if you go to an interview for a product manager position and you talk about like Scrum or Agile, they're going to look at you like, what are you talking about? That isn't, like, we don't do product, which is how they develop software. So it's really relevant for software, but not relevant for outdoor and for physical products. And so, the course, so I would say so that's one piece. The other piece is lots of people reach out to me on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'd like to get into the industry. Or there's people that are already product managers in tech, for example, and say, I'm sick of working on software. I want to work on product that I'm passionate about. Like, how do I do that? So I found people were asking the same questions, and I was sort of giving the same advice. So I just decided, yeah, I'm going to, there's this sort of online certificate trend kind of in the technology space. And there's people that are clearly interested in getting into product management in the outdoor industry that aren't getting that type of specific instruction in the programs that they're coming through. And so, and a big part of the way that I'm looking at it is, you guys as designers and developers, you work on portfolios, right? So you have that work product to be able to go and say, well, I haven't done this, but I did something similar, right? And this is how I worked through the problem, and this is the design, right? But as a product manager, you don't. And so a big part of what I think is valuable is walking potential product managers through this process of, like, finding a problem, how do you write a product brief, how do you validate, how do you do market research, and then talking about the design and development process. So they've kind of run through the full process specific to outdoor and physical products instead of something like software. So yeah, so I'm planning on kicking that off in March and kind of just trying it out for the first time. It's going to be an 8-week program, 2 nights a week, and we'll just see how it goes and see if it adds value and if it's, but honestly, it's the course that I wish I could have taken, and it would have been a real advantage for me to do that. So yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
What's kind of your research process when it comes to building a brief, trend analysis or customer research?
I think the thing that so the research is different at every company I've worked at, and the reason is that different companies have different resources. You as a product manager have different resources because you have different, like, some companies, like if you look at REI, for example, or if you look at any brand where you have a really broad category assortment, it's going to be really hard to become an expert in any one of those areas, right? Because if you're managing socks, hats, gloves, camp gear, hammocks, you have to pick your battles, right? You have to decide where you want to focus. And so I think, again, it just sort of varies by brand. At REI, they specifically had like a market research group, and so you sort of plugged in with them during the process. Like when you go to trade shows, you meet with retailers, you go on sales calls with reps, and you spend time in the store to kind of see what is happening with the consumer, right? And that's sort of a starting point. And then once you had sort of a question you wanted to answer, then you would sort of formulate that to them. They would do sort of like the focus group work, and then you would bring that back into the process. I think the main point about market research is, again, it's different everywhere you go, and it's always an accumulation of lots of different work. It's not like you're like, okay, I'm going to go do market research now, and you just spend a month like doing market research, because you never have the time to do that. And so you're always learning. And again, whether you're with sales, you're in a sales meeting, or you're on a sales call, or you're at trail days or Appalachian Trail Days where you're talking with through hikers. All those things accumulate into quote unquote market research. You know, I think one of the things that we did, we had a women's specific project at Oboz, and Oboz was really good at men's product and not as good at women's product. So as soon as we briefed that, it was like, okay, we know men's product pretty well, so we don't need to do like a focus group, but with women's product we do. So that was like immediately get a focus group of women, and then we actually used, we sort of checked in with those women throughout the process. We showed them designs, we showed them colors, we came in and used them as fit samples, fit trialers. And so, you know, I think that's a pretty good, you know, scenario if you can pull people in throughout the process. But it's always, you know, it's never like this one act of going out and I'm doing market research now, I have the answer. Right? It's lots of accumulated knowledge over time. At REI, numbers were huge. You know, I think one of the other things that you'd see as a product manager is, so NPD, if anyone's familiar, it's basically like your market data. So you can pull data, because they basically pull sales information from all the retailers in the US. So you can go through and you can find out that the Hoka, you know, whatever the Hoka is in blue is the top, you know, they've grown 400%, and they're the top selling style. So there's something about that style or color that's sort of trending, right? A lot of companies, it's super expensive. Like the minimum buy-in is like $60,000 or $70,000 to buy that data. So some companies have it, some companies don't. If you're a small company, you're probably not going to have it. So you got to get creative to use different types of information, and you just use what you can and fill in the rest, right? But at REI, you had all the data, because you had REI sales data, which is half the market, right? So you could pull that data and you knew exactly who was selling what, how big the market was. But again, you have to get creative at most companies. So, yep.
Along that same line, do you create a brief for every individual shoot, or is it more like a broad market return hit, and these are some products that would fit that market?
Both. I mean, you do both, and it's sort of, you do detail out, and you know, companies do it differently. I put some level of detail at the style level, and if it's a new category, that means you're going to need to paint more of a category picture, right? And like more about that new customer and like the specific customer you're trying to target, and then within that, you're gonna there might be things that lay across the full collection. Like for example, I worked on more of it was a younger customer, more of a lifestyle product. So one of the overarching things that needed to be included was one simple sustainability story. So that was relevant to the 4 styles that were in the collection, but then it was detailed out to say we need a knit, we need a leather, we need, you know, like sort of what those specific individual styles are, but it's all written as one brief, if that makes sense, because it's sort of the collection brief, but then you go down to the style level in the brief. And sometimes you do that, and sometimes you don't, honestly. Like, it depends on the company, and it depends on how they do things. There's some product managers that will sort of just throw out, we just need this collection, right? And then the design team will do more research to figure out exactly what that means, or like what that should be from a style count, or, you know, what that assortment looks like. But I find it works best when kind of product management runs that and kind of works with design. You know, and even product management, like, one of the things about product management is that you never do anything by yourself. Like, you're always including different departments and different teams, having lots of different discussions, and the decisions you're making are based on all this feedback from all these different people in the organization. I think that's when it works the best. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. And sometimes you're creating a brief that's multi-season, because if you're getting into a new category, you might lay out like a 3-year plan and say, I'm briefing the 3-year plan, but I'm only putting specifics in year 1, and then the next season you'll get specifics on 2 and 3, but it helps the team to understand where the collection, where the category is going, and that there's going to be a 2 and a 3 as part of that same collection. So you don't always do that, but it definitely happens sometimes, right? Yep, go ahead.
So talking about teamwork and working in different departments, is there values or attributes you've seen in designers and developers that are awesome, like they're really good to work on, and then what can we do to like trying to develop those skills? What are some of those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think designers, the product teams that I've been a part of that work the best, like those three legs of the stool work really well together. And I think that teams that are really healthy are open for like vigorous debate, right, and vigorous discussion. So I think point number one is be open to people saying, well, why are you doing that? Or, you know, sort of, it could feel like questioning or criticizing, but like asking questions, right? I think that's really critical. But the other piece that I think is really critical is respecting people on the team in their area of expertise. So like as a product manager, I want to be open to a designer saying, well, that's a stupid strategy. Like, why are we should be going after this customer, or you're segmenting the market wrong. It's this customer, right? But then when it comes down to it, I expect that they sort of like respect me and say, like, you listen to me, but it's ultimately like it's your call. And I think it's similar like with designers. The best designers that I've worked with are open to having that debate, but then also saying, but you're the expert. So if you think that it should go that way, like I've sort of given you my feedback, being open to feedback, but also sort of going, I don't know if that answers your question. I think both of those are pretty critical. And again, not just for designers, but for product managers. I think something else that is super important is designers, and you guys will hear this, there's this sort of mentality of, because in some companies the designer just sort of draws the shoe or whatever and sort of kicks it over, and then they're like, I don't know, you guys figure out how to make it, right? And I think when it works best is when there's a lot of involvement early on, that design and development are involved in the briefing process, that that design and development are working together closely, like during the concepting phases, and product management as well, so that when you actually get a Proto 1, the product manager isn't like, well, hey, this isn't what I briefed at all, right? Like, you've all been sort of involved in that process to make sure that you're all aligned. And again, open, vigorous debate, but also like respect for kind of the different areas that each member of the team is responsible for, and they're the expert in fundamentally. So yeah, great question. And as far as far as developing that, I mean, you guys work on projects, and I would, you need to be, like, you need to develop a little bit of thick skin to be able to like take feedback. And again, I would say that's for everybody on a product team, not just designers, but it is an important attribute, because you're going to get, you're going to get pushback. It's just sort of part of the process. Yep.
Is there anything that you've seen repeatedly in like your networking or interviews that are bad things that we should stay away from or not do? I don't know.
I mean, I think I think once you get further in your career, understanding, like, looking at past experiences and framing them from a standpoint of like what you've learned, as opposed to whether they were like objectively positive or negative, is pretty important. Like, it's important for you in your career, and it's important that, because you don't want to go into an interview and they say, well, how was working at this brand? You're like, oh man, I hated those guys. They were, it was a terrible company. Like, understand that there's positives and negatives, and sort of frame each experience as, what did I learn? What was the opportunity? There were good things. Maybe there were challenges. I think it's probably okay to mention challenges, but I think generally focusing on what you learned is probably a better approach. That'll turn people off pretty quickly in an interview. Yep.
How important do you think cover letters are? Like, how much of an effect do you think they have? Like, how often do you think they actually get read?
I mean, I don't personally think they're important, but I think that if a company asks for it, then you got to do it. I mean, that's kind of my. But I would also say that if you've actively like done the work before, then the cover letter is even less important, because you've sort of written a cover letter that mattered, which is the cover letter that you hand wrote, or it's the cover letter that you wrote to the HR person when you saw it posted, and you're like, hey, remember I talked to this person, I'm super interested in this job, here's my background. Like, that sort of becomes your cover letter, and that's important. Like, the cover letter that you have to upload into the recruiting system, it's not that important. But if they're requiring it, then do it. And I know that's not like a great answer, but I think that's kind of that's been my experience at least, yeah.
So I know like when you said like sometimes you're including like, you know, the sustainable aspect or story into a product. How much of that is left up to like the designer's discretion, or like how much is going to come from like a product manager?
I think it totally depends, honestly. I think it really depends on, like there have been times when it's been briefed really tightly, and there's been times where it's been totally left up to design and development. Like, and then I can think of 2 specific projects that I worked on at Oboz, where the only requirement that I put in the brief was that it had to be simple. We couldn't have 15 different sustainability stories, we had to have one, and it had to be compelling. And so we ended up going with algae footbeds. And we had a lot of discussion about what that meant. And like during the process, it wasn't like they just got the brief and then said, here's what we're going to do. It was like, this is what we're trying to accomplish. As we got into the project, we all sort of thought about it and debated it and came to something that addressed the brief appropriately, right? But there's been other times where we literally said, and there was a project where the project was to take an existing style and make an eco version. So we said there's no limit on FOB, there's no limit on retail, like you just need to make the most killer sustainable version of this product that you can. And that was a conversation that we had with the development team, was to say, this is up to you guys. Like, we need you to go out and do the research, you know, meet with the factories, meet with the vendors, and like, what are the options? We don't know. And so that was a specific kind of project for them. So it's gonna go both ways. But I think generally designers and developers, that's part of what they do on trips to Asia, is meeting with suppliers and sort of just asking them, like, we know we're moving in this direction, so there's this type of material that we're going to be interested in when you know, or like when you sort of hear about it. And that's kind of how it works over time, right? You sort of get these different options and they bubble up over time. So.
We're basically out of time, so let's go ahead and get Dawson.
Awesome. Thanks.